Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. Welcome back to my podcast listeners for our foreign affairs focused discussions after I had a couple of travel episodes after travelling over the autumn. And welcome to the first episode of 2025. Really excited, Matt, to have you here with us to discuss some of the things that are going on at the beginning of this year. I'd love you to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a bit about your background.
Hi, Anna Joy. Thank you for having me. I guess my background is in communications. I am a communications specialist. Some would call that some form of spin doctor. I'm not sure that's correct. So have spent the past 20 odd years working in political, diplomatic and NGO communications. My last job before I kind of went freelance last year was I was the Director of Communications and Spokesperson for the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat, which is the organisation that does the diplomatic relations between Commonwealth member states. It's involved a lot of talking with different member states, sort of interaction with different multilateral organisations, summits, COPs, heads of government meetings, that kind of thing. Lots of working with those governments and their spokespeople. Before that, I lived in Myanmar. And while there, I worked as a communications expert running a team of people on British aid programmes that occurred through the Rohingya genocide and the kind of conflict that followed on from that. Previous to all of that, I was based at the British Treasury for about 5 years, working for two different chancellors, both Labour and Conservative. I also worked for the Labour Party separately. I guess my background has been Westminster and political comms, NGO development and diplomatic. So I've got quite a broad spectrum of experience to draw on.
Yeah, and I think that's something I really appreciate about you, because I think you're incredibly insightful around Western politics and political insights. But you really do have that background as well, working with smaller nations in the global south. You've lived in Myanmar. And so I always find you've got that balance, I guess, to how you see the world. So really glad to have you here. So we're at the beginning of 2025. We just had the inauguration of the US President, Donald Trump. And I was reflecting on the fact that any year when we have a change in US President, it feels like the year starts with a bit of a bang, doesn't it? Things get shaken up. We obviously knew that would be the case from November. Do you want to tell us a bit about what your reflections are so far from that turn of events?
I guess there's a couple of lessons that people generally globally, I place myself in the kind of centre progressive left bit of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Certainly not on the right of politics. For me and for people like me in that area of politics, I think we need to kind of think quite clearly about what lessons we can learn from Trump and his impact on the world and what lessons we shouldn't be learning. I think one of the lessons I learned last time Trump was in was to really ignore the noise. And from a communications standpoint, he is very good at dominating news cycles with very little, except for aggression and kind of heat and light without any real kind of depth there. So it kind of concerned that we all get distracted by the circus rather than actually focusing on what's actually happening. Certainly one of the most immediately impactful things that Trump has done coming into power is the cancellation, just the halting of aid. I have a friend who worked on Brexit and he no longer has any kind of meaningful job. And we are seeing its impact immediately. It's having a kind of really significant impact in the global south, especially the strategic areas that the US should care about. It should be worried about kind of some of the immediate cuts and the impact that will have, not just on its reputation, but also on its ability to function and the ability of its aid programs to function, for it to be a reliable partner going forward. It may be the Trump administration doesn't care about that now, but if South Sudan falls apart off the back of stuff that's going on in Sudan at the moment, that conflict starts to bleed out into different parts of Africa, in part because the US has stopped funding programs in South Sudan, we may see an immediate impact there that will be detrimental to the US's interests. But there doesn't seem to have been thought to that. And so it's kind of slightly chaotic nature of the absolute stop straight away, I think is problematic. Globally, politically, the big issue for me and my concern is that we are going into 2025 with a massive rightward tilt of what the G7, traditionally the kind of leading democracies, or at least the biggest economies, democratic economies in the world, and power basing in days gone by to do things like kind of the Millennium Development Goals and stuff like that. A massive rightward shift. We obviously have Trump We have Meloni in Italy. We have the incoming election in Germany, where it's almost definitely likely that Scholz will lose. And so we are looking at kind of the AfD actually coming second in polling, which is incredibly worrying. Very right-wing, very kind of extreme party there coming into power in some form or kind of being the major opposition. We have Japan always being right-wing. They always have a vaguely right-wing government. They have pretty much forever. But there is also, on top of that, Macron is kind of a bit of a lame duck in France. We have massive problems in Canada. Maybe the Liberals will pull back. And maybe Mark Carney will kind of will save the centrist dads too much heartache in that. But actually, in this very short space of time, we've seen centre-left progressive governments kind of lose power and very quickly seen this massive rise. And I think that changes the tone of international debate. Last year, people were already looking forward to COP. Look at COP. It's a great opportunity. It's in Brazil. Lula will push things, off the back of some of the less helpful COPs in less helpful countries. But now going into COP, I think many people will be very concerned that we won't see meaningful progress because actually there'll be a massive withdrawal. I mean, the US has already indicated that it will withdraw. What will that mean for the global south? For a lot of the countries that are really dependent on that conversation moving on and progress being made. So I think that's a very broad and quick sweep. But the quick switch to dominance of away from progressive government towards more populist right-wing government in this literally in a matter of months is a massive issue.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I'm really glad to actually focus on that, because my take when I was looking at the roundups and the look into 2025 is you've got a lot of things that feel like their continuity, their massive expansion and growth, and the focus needs to be very firmly on them, such as the technological change, climate change, the ongoing conflict of Ukraine, in addition, the Middle East conflict, which we're obviously seeing movement in. But you've got these things that continue from 2024. But then you've got quite a different picture in terms of elections, because last year I was talking to our guest Andrew, and it was the year of 40% of the world was going to the polls. It was a real mixed bag. And when you looked across the world, we were having a really interesting conversation. And what's going to happen here? What's going to happen here? And yet this year is really quite different when you look at elections, and it sits on top of the election of Donald Trump. And it really takes us down the route of understanding where things are at. And I think that your point about how that influences global conversation about these really big issues that we're confronting at a global scale, whether it's conflict or technology or the threat of climate change, is really, really significant. Tell us a bit more about what you're seeing with that.
Sure. I mean, and again, kind of by no means an expert in all of these countries, but I think what's helpful sometimes in these situations is to look at counterfactuals to see what has happened over the past 4 years, understand what progress has been made, and ask the question, would that progress have been made kind of in this environment? So, for example, let's talk about Mia Mottley in Barbados. A phenomenal woman. I'm a massive fan. I was a fan before all of you were fans, just so you know, mainly because of the Commonwealth. I was exposed to her and I'd kind of interacted with her team a little bit. And so when she gained more and more prominence with the British Initiative and kind of stuff, what was amazing to see was Joe Biden walking through COP with Mia Mottley. I think it was COP or the UN, just to really understand the gravity that this phenomenal woman really is, but the reception that she got and the kind of the quick promotion of her to being quite a leading figure. I mean, I think there was the new head of the World Bank did a speech with her. I mean, it was like this phenomenal fanfare. Would that have happened with Trump, with Meloni, with a different government in Germany? The obvious answer is no. It would not have been received in the same way. So if we are moving into this slightly different era where political narrative, atmosphere, weather, as we sometimes call it, is dominated by populist right-wing kind of narratives, where are the voices of the global south going to be given room to articulate the reality of the situations they face? And the point I think I would make, which is kind of most people will know, is that the demographics of the world are turning against the West very sharply. Africa is growing exponentially. We have this vastly different population in kind of 10, 20, 30 years' time, much larger, better educated. All of these dynamics will change the way we talk about the world and the voices that are given prominence. And the West has a choice how it deals with that. The post-colonial debate is quite interesting. Talk about reparations. All of that kind of language that feeds into the kind of global debate about, we might not think it's that important for us domestically, but when you get to a COP, when you get to a UN summit, when you get to a Commonwealth Heads of Government summit, these narratives are really important. And if the West ignores them, it ignores them at its peril, because it ends up just misstepping. And part of the reason why my boss at the Commonwealth was reappointed as the Secretary General of the Commonwealth in Rwanda in 2022 was because the West, which was the UK, Canada, Australia, misstepped in the way that it talks to these other countries because it didn't really grasp the stories, the narratives, the conversations that are going on. And it means that you can achieve much less. And so looking ahead to COP, hoping their expectation, the big push there's going to be about this, if we had a Harris White House and a kind of a Starmer Labour government and a Scholz kind of Germany and Macron in Paris, you could see that is an entirely different COP to the one that we are likely to have this year. But because of the missteps and the electoral success of the right and the missteps of the progressive left or centre left, or however you want to describe it, it's going to be a very different COP. And I suspect that it will be a far more confrontational. That doesn't mean that the demands won't be made. It means that it'll be far more confrontational. So we will see the voices of small island developing states who are at the front line of climate change, who are the most affected, who are literally sinking the seas. What reason do they have to hold back? What is being offered to them that will enable them to kind of walk away with the success? Same with Africa, desertification, expanded population, kind of food security. All these issues are pressing concerns for them. But we have looking into those kind of summits, looking at UN General Assembly, I'm expecting we'll have a much more confrontational year, because actually, I mean, Trump will get away with some of the stuff, the recent stuff he did with the Colombia, where he bullied them quite quickly into accepting returning kind of migrants to Colombia. But I can't see, the global south being cowed. And the outplay of this over the first Trump presidency was the rise of dominance, not of America, but actually of China and Russia. The outworking of this was that it enabled China and Russia to be, and again, people listening to this podcast may not share my worldview, that I think that China is a problem for the world to deal with. They may not be as hawkish as I may be, or China isn't particularly hawkish, but China is integrating itself into the global south, and not just through the ways we know about, through kind of like the example, the Sri Lankan port and debt, but also through communications. The Chinese media networks are expanding out and increasing capacity. The retreat of organizations like the BBC from their kind of global role has led to China increasingly being present, Al Jazeera, all these other news sources. It means that the West is not leading or not even leading the conversation in the global south. We may think, fine, whatever, we'll stick to ourselves. But when it comes to trying to get things done, when it comes, for example, to opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has consequences. When it comes to climate change, it has consequences. When it comes to a multitude of other international issues, the retreat of Trump in his first term, and what we expect will be a rather belligerent retreat in the second term, will weaken the West, as we call them. And I think that is a trend that I think we'll see not just this year, but going forward. And what you will see is the rising counter narratives that are unhelpful to the West, that will be seeded out by Russia, by China, possibly by India as well. I think India is an interesting separate case. But yeah, and I think that that's deeply problematic in my worldview, where I think we need to see coordinated, persistent, robust action on things like climate change going forwards. And I think that that's concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to come to the UK because it's almost the obvious question when we're talking about this. The UK does have a Labour government. It's almost on a slightly different cycle than other countries, I sometimes feel like, partly because I think we had our Brexit moment. And so we're almost slightly delayed in some of the rise of the far right, for example, gaining more airspace, airtime, perhaps now.
Well, I think we may actually have been the canary.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think that there is a real sense that we went too fitted into quite a polarized debate, and actually the public got quite tired of that. And we have, there is, without quoting Tolkien, even dragons kind of have their day, right? There is a sense that we entered Brexit was incredibly divisive. It caused massive reputational and structural damage to the UK, not just its economy, but society, cohesion, all this kind of stuff. We had kind of MPs literally, murdered. It was a brutal time. And I think there is a sense that we maybe are seeing some of the outworkings of that in other places now. And it is cyclical, so we will come back round again. One of the things I observed about Trump, which I think is interesting to consider, and I'll give some background to this, is that one of the notable things that lots of people talked about at the inauguration was the presence of the social media kind of tech bro moguls, right? So not just Elon Musk, but also kind of Facebook, Google, they were there. And I think one of the probably worrying trends that we've not really articulated or thought about yet, but which is having far too profound impact on our public discourse about politics and democracy and all the rest of it, is the impact of social media on news. Now, there's a couple of things to say first. I mean, people are focused on Elon Musk because he's being outrageous. He's kind of tweeting the AfD and attacking the Prime Minister of the UK. I mean, it's demonstrably not a good thing. It's something that goes beyond the bounds of normal behavior. But to be quite frank, he's not the first to have massively interfered with states. I mean, the example of Facebook and Australia being a massive example of that, where Australia sought to protect its news gathering sites and basically embargoed by Facebook because of it. I think one of the Facebook examples that people know very little about and is not talked about is because I was in Myanmar during the Rohingya genocide. The role of Facebook in that genocide is demonstrated. It's appalling. They were warned, they did nothing. A kind of microcosm of the negative impact of social media upon the society. There was, Facebook groups being run by Buddhist nationalist monks that were encouraging people. I have heard people compare it to the role of radio in the Rwanda genocide. People have talked about it as a similar accelerant to the violence that came. And so I think that those are specific examples, but I think the underlying trend with social media is this undercutting of the usual, what we have become used to, or what society is used to, as a kind of news media. We know that newspapers are failing. We know that their revenues are going. What that has meant, as they have had less and less advertising revenues, people have moved to social media, is that they've followed out the news gathering organizations. As a spokesperson for the Commonwealth, I could 30 years ago have rung or spoken to a East Africa correspondent or a West Africa or a Southern Africa, whatever, a country-specific Africa correspondent for most of the global newspapers. None of those exist anymore. If I try and talk to someone from a national broadsheet in the UK, in Kenya, they're not there. There is literally a hollowing out of global news capacity, and that happens at local news level. It happens throughout the system. And so what we have instead is a kind of lack of time, energy, and resource to cover stories in depth. And that lends more weight to the social media companies and their ability just to flush out snippets of news. And so we're in a bit of a kind of spiral that we need to consider how we stop. How do we stop the disintegration of the normality of authoritative news? We probably can't stop it. So how do we therefore deal with a world where kind of facts are negotiable and clout is more important than kind of concise, accurate coverage, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because it links back to your point that you made earlier, which is if you look at the space for different narratives at a global level, you can actually see in that world that you get countries and regions and continents can end up with completely different takes on things, and the other parts of the world literally don't get or don't understand at all where those regions or those countries are then coming from. The people that stand in the middle of that in terms of the translation between regions and the way that they talk each other and diplomacy becomes absolutely essential.
So, and I saw this in my job. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, the immediate reaction of those of us who were based in London, who were from the West, was, this should be condemned. And so, and probably not particularly helpfully for my boss, we arranged for a statement to go out to Commonwealth issue. But we arranged for a statement to go, anti-democratic, I can't remember what the exact wording was, but the Secretary General just said something. And the backlash from some member states was significant because actually their story is not our story. And it never was.
No, it never was. No.
But what I think we're unaware of is actually how divergent those stories have become quite sharply. And actually, I think we need to question why. And I would say because Russia and other countries have invested heavily in non-traditional influencing, actually. And I think we need to, there's a slight naivety about the West. I mean, I heard someone interestingly say, criticizing the US, saying when the US says that we need to stop foreign influencing operations, I mean, they're the biggest foreign influencing operation in the world. And I think there's some truth in that. They have always been kind of extraterritorial in their influencing operations, trying to use stuff. But I think where we seem to have lost the march is actually in many of those countries that are going to become increasingly important over the next 10, 20, 30 years, where because of demographic growth or kind of resources that they have, there has been a definite loss of stature, a loss of influence for the West because social media has been used to critique the West. And I'm not saying that there isn't validity in some of the things they're being saying. I mean, I find those conversations entirely detached, the conversations that are being had and the stories, the narratives that are being told. And I think that the big risk, I think, for me, for this kind of rightward sweep is in its splendid isolationism, as it withdraws aid, as it starts to bully countries. It just gives so much more space for that gap to grow. Instead of talking about shared democratic values, you're talking in confidential ways. I mean, that's my big concern in 2025, but not just for 2025, but going forward. One, that will have an immediate impact. And two, that the progressive centre left has no hopeful alternative at the moment that it's offering. So how do people I know start to build more alternative, kind of hopeful alternatives? Because I don't think that we're doing that, which is why we're losing.
Yeah. Well, I was going to land there, actually. I was going to say, and we talk about this, don't we? You can see things in the world and there are things that are happening at the moment, but we still want to be people that are able to encourage people to have agency and also be hopeful or know where to put their vision and their focus. I'm really interested, firstly, on your take at an individual level. I think it's so good to be articulating and talking about these things because actually we are all consumers of the media, of social media, and you could sometimes be unaware how much you're being influenced or how much you might need to be very deliberate in sourcing other forms of input. Of course, there is an individual view and there's also a national view.
It's a very personal example, but I stood for election in the last election as a Labour candidate, not in a seat that was ever winnable by Labour, but because then there was candidates. And anyway, it was something I wanted to do and I did it. But I had a really interesting interaction. Labour had introduced a policy about school feeding. We were going to introduce breakfast clubs. And the teacher stood up and said, "This is outrageous. This is going to take resource away. Why are we doing this?" And I said, "Do you know what? I actually do some work for an NGO that feeds 500,000 kids every day in schools in Kenya, and it does it using technology and data in a really kind of cost-efficient way, and it means that kids are learning. And if we can do it in Kenya, why don't we think we can do it in the UK?" And there is a kind of sense that there are so many amazing things going on at the same time, but it's just not what's talked about. And so the Overton window, what is talked about is really important. And I think the framing in Westminster at the moment is unhelpful because it is entirely obsessed with, I think, the past 10 years of chaos, right? The journalists, the politicians, everyone's addicted to this kind of maelstrom of chaos that came post-Brexit, followed into COVID and then the fall and collapse of the Tory party. And that we've kind of become used to that pace. And it's a bit like we need to kind of come off that drug and we need to start considering policy and actually looking at what's going on. And I think there really is a sense about sourcing your news. I'm also trying to read more consistently, but not everyone has time to do that. Part of the responsibility of people like me, who are communications people who work for, I'm currently working for various politicians who work in this field, is to insist upon seriousness, to stop indulging in the nonsense, to insist on kind of balance and to set the tone. Gordon Brown used to call it setting the weather. You frame a debate and its parameters. You set the weather for the day. I think we need to think about that more seriously. We also need to start telling the story as it is, rather than kind of how other people would like to say it is. We are in an incredibly febrile state in the West about a lot of this stuff at the moment. I think social media is pushing our buttons because there have been various crises, post-COVID, all the rest of it. I think there needs to be a consistent effort to not indulge in the type of nonsense that perpetuates that. So not calling for someone's head, to deriding people. But I mean, I wonder if Michelle Obama would still say this, but she obviously famously said, they go no, we go high. It's really easy to be gloomy and cynical. My starting off point is that I'm aware that we need to be more hopeful. I think part of that is about the story we decide to tell. So if we are talking about the British economy in the UK, let's talk about the fact that we are investing in our future, that we're building a better Britain, that we are putting, so I used this in an article the other day, but we are using a narrative that puts flesh and bones on the dreams of the people in the country. You know, we are building something, we will not be put back. And I think globally, we need to find like-minded people who are persistently optimistic and want to tell a story that counters against it. And I mean, you can start with Mia Mottley, go back to Mia Mottley. I mean, not just her, but there are definitely kind of voices globally that are far more kind of persuasive and hopeful.
I love it.
The world faces an incredibly tough period. You know, there's loads of challenges, but point to me a time in the last millennia when that has not been the case. I mean, but what the West was much better about articulating was a confidence in its forward journey. And I think we've lost that kind of confidence. Interestingly, I had to write something on AI the other day, and AI has huge potential. We all recognize that. It's potential, but it is potential right now. But the reason why we find it so enticing is it gives us a dream, right? You know, it gives a lot of people the opportunity to dream. I would argue that actually, AI aside, we need to start giving people an option to dream for a future again, for a hope in a future. And that progressives have never won by getting down into the gutter and fighting it out with the kind of, there are times, Cable Street, whatever in the UK, where we have to defend against bigotry and hate and right-wing extremism. We've never won a political argument by getting down into a gutter with them, right? We need to offer more compelling, hopeful vision. And I think that is where kind of the responsibility of communicators and politicians and policymakers is. We need to not kind of be as defensive as we can sometimes be and actually be far more front-footed and hopeful.
I love that. A call to hope in 2025 and to seek out the hope as we see narratives shift and the space shift and as we look at these global challenges. I really appreciate the way that you've actually talked through so much there, but then taken us back to that fundamental, which we all want to hold on to as we look at a new year, especially when we're in the UK, if people are in a rainy January. Matt, tell us how people can follow you if they're interested in what you're doing and more of your thoughts.
I'm a low profile guy online, but I am on Blue Sky. You can follow me on Matt Pat V1 Blue Sky. That would be fantastic. But thank you, Anna Joy.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.